Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking from Chatham House. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. Syria has seen the worst violence since the fall of the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad in December. That raises urgent questions about whether its new leader, the interim President Ahmed al-Shara, will help the country to thrive as he has promised, as a democracy, attracting investment, or whether yet again Syria is set for sectarian violence, retribution, and perhaps Sharia law. Meanwhile, the economy is disintegrating, making life tough even for those who were overjoyed at the end of Assad repression and welcomed the new leader. This latest violence began when 13 government personnel were killed following an ambush. The ensuing fighting then centred around the western coastal region, which is a stronghold for Assad supporters, heartland of the Alawite sect. It's not known how many people have since been killed, but some estimates put numbers over 1,000. Meanwhile, pretty well every country in the region is trying to affect the outcome, but they have different visions in mind for what that outcome might be. To discuss what these developments mean, I'm joined this week by Dr. Haid. He's a consulting fellow of the Chatham House Middle East and North Africa programme, and he's just returned from Syria. We have with us also Dr. Reem Turkmani, research fellow in the Conflict and Civic Society Research Group at the London School of Economics, who heads up that group's work on Syria. And we're joined by Dr. Lina Khatib, Associate Fellow also with our Middle East and North Africa programme, who writes widely about the politics and power in the wider region. Welcome to you all. Haid, you've been back to Syria twice this year. What is it like?
Well, it was different from the first time to the second time, although the difference between the two is just a couple of weeks. And the first time people were optimistic, happy, and they were looking forward to all the basically promises that were shared by the new authorities. However, when I went again in February and stayed there for a couple of weeks, the mood was different. People were more tired. The economic situation was extremely bad. People were not able to access their money. There was limits on what they can withdraw, on the amounts they can withdraw from the banks. Service provision was also bad. People expected more from the government.
What kind of service provision?
Everything from water to electricity, even cleaning the streets. There were a lot of promises that were made by the new authorities right after they took basically power in Syria. But most of those promises were not implemented. And lastly, the security situation, even before the recent escalation in the coastal area, was not great. People were complaining about increased level of criminality across Syria, revenge killing in particular areas, including in coastal areas. So as a result of all of that, I think people were more pessimistic and were not sure about what the future holds for them.
Where were you in the country?
I went to different areas. So I entered to Damascus and then went to southern Syria, Suwaida, then went to Aleppo, Idlib, and then even Homs, Hama, and then to the coastal area before going back.
And when you say people can't access their money, what does that mean?
Basically, the central bank imposed restrictions on the amount that people can withdraw from the banks. And because of that, many people cannot access their funds or deposits. That does not only apply to individuals, but also businesses and charities. And that's why many of them are struggling, maintaining their operations and being able to even help each other.
We're seeing more reports of imports coming in now, more kinds of goods that weren't there, but people still not able to buy them in many cases.
Exactly. I think if you want to talk about the positive side, you have many goods that have become available, especially foreign goods, because the Syrian regime before did not allow many of them, especially US-made ones, to basically make it to Syria. But also the prices of different commodities were reduced as well. You talk about fuel, for example, or other goods, because of the value of the Syrian lira increase and because the taxes on basically imports were decreased, and because of those prices were slightly better. However, as you mentioned, they don't have the purchasing power to really benefit from this opportunity.
Reem, you've also been there since the new regime took over about 3 months ago. You were there a couple of months ago? Is that right? Are you hearing then and now this same kind of more worried tone coming in?
Yeah, absolutely. People were more worried, and it differs depend on where you go. I went around Homs. I come from Homs. I went to all areas, people from Alawite background, Sunni Christian background.
The Alawite is the group, the sect that Assad came from.
Yes, absolutely. And when I came back, while there were so many worries on my mind, but by far the biggest one was the security sector. And I was going everywhere and saying, listen, there are so many risks, but the biggest is going to come from the security sector, and it's going to take a couple of months, and it's going to happen. It was inevitable. If you go around, talk to people, understand what's going on, you see that what happened during the last week was coming indeed.
So let's come on to what happened in the last week. We had these killings the past few days, and they, in many people's eyes, raise a lot of questions about the ability of Syria to become a stable state. These were targeted killings in the coastal areas of Tartus, Latakia and Hama, the worst violence seen since the regime change in December. Reem, what was going on there?
To understand what was going on, it's useful to draw some analogy with Iraq after the Iraq invasion, where Iraq, we had a regime who comes from minority, kind of Sunni minority, was controlling Iraq with extreme, coercive power. Saddam Hussein, exactly. And with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, after that, so many huge mistakes were committed, like the army was dissolved, the minorities were excluded, we had the process of de-Baathification. So suddenly we had a minority that feel completely excluded out of the new system. It took few months for armed resistance to start, and then eventually we got ISIS. And there was nothing to say that this is not going to be repeated in Syria. So you go to Syria, you realize the army was dissolved, security forces were dissolved. All these officers, they did not disappear. They were roaming around. They were still in the country. There was no transitional justice process to absorb this.
So this is Assad's old officers. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And what have they done, and what's been done to the
Assad's
Alawites?
officers, particularly those who were in the leading positions in the army and the security forces and the paramilitary, they committed horrific crimes. Many, but not all, come from an Alawite background, and many of them just escaped to the coastal region, particularly the mountain region, because that's a geography where they can escape, they can protect them. It's difficult to stay in the cities, it's easy to arrest you. And the entire Alawite community, which was not heavily involved in this, many of them had nothing to do with this, they felt excluded, completely excluded. Everything that emerged, all the committees that were formed, that excluded them completely. They felt they had no backing. Already the regime let them down. So the frustration was building up. Many of their young men were laid off, they were fired from the state civil servant positions. So I think all these officers, they built on that frustration. Assad's old officers, they did mobilize the Alawite community based on those grievances, based on that exclusion, and they hit back. And it took them a few months to organize, but you could see it was almost inevitable, because at the same time with all of this, the new authorities have formed new security forces, that's the army and the security forces, that are sectarian, very sectarian, led by extreme Sunnis. Some of them are not even Syrians.
And they've hit back in turn,
yes,
haven't they, against the Alawites? So, can you just spell out for us what is known about who has killed whom?
Well, just to continue with what Reem started, there were the former regime forces ambushed the security forces in different areas, and that basically triggered a large-scale military campaign against those forces across the coastal areas as well as Hama.
So it's the new regime forces hitting back against the Alawite community,
and officially against the old forces. However, because of basically lack of capacity and lack of discipline among the forces that were mobilized to go there, because they needed big numbers, you have some of those forces committed crimes against civilians in different areas. Now, when we talk about numbers, the numbers are not clear, but we talk about hundreds of civilians who were killed by those forces. And what happened is that this, for sure, increased tension, increased sectarian sort of discourse, and led to wide criticism of the current administration.
So, Lina, just taking a step back, what should we make of this when we look at the chances of Syria becoming a stable state, perhaps under this interim president, al-Shara?
This underlines the complexity of the situation, and that to really have stability, there are a number of things that need to happen simultaneously. But currently, it doesn't look like Syria on its own has the capacity to do any of those things. And these are transitional justice, security sector reform that addresses the matter of discipline that Hayat talked about, but also capacity, and crucially, the issue of political inclusion, because sorting out stability is not about a security-only approach. In fact, the security-only approach is likely to make matters worse. And Syria needs help on all three fronts.
It is incredibly complicated to bring together a single government for a country that has many sectarian divisions within it. When you said that little phrase, transitional justice, that is a short phrase for a whole body of work in countries and in academia on what do you do about justice for crimes of the past and reconciling those people with society. I'd like from all three of you just to go into this question now of what we should make of interim president al-Shara. A few months ago, he was leading the HTS, a group of fighters with roots in al-Qaeda. And now, and I'm going to read you something The Economist has just written on this. It's called him inscrutable. He switches between military fatigues and sharp suits. He tells Westerners what they want to hear, that he will establish a diverse government based on competence, not ethnicity or religion. But, all that said, while he's promised that Syrians should choose their own leaders, there isn't a sign of elections, and he won't say if he's going to allow political parties, and has not ruled out imposing Sharia or Islamic law. Lina, what do you make of him?
I've been tracking the evolution of him and HTS for the last 10 years. And 10 years ago, I was one of the first people to write an analysis piece that's public about how, at the time, I saw al-Nusra Front, as his group was known at the time, moving away from al-Qaeda. And I said at the time that they have political ambitions and want to be at the table whenever political transition happens in Syria. And here we are a decade later. So he is pragmatic, and he is willing to do a lot in order to gain legitimacy from the international community. But at the same time, these forces that are aligned with his group, at the very least aligned, let's just say at the very least aligned, they are jihadists and they are extremists in their thinking. They, for example, bear a lot of hatred for the Alawite community and believe that the Alawites should be excluded, believe that this is a Sunni resurrection in Syria and that Sunnis are entitled to dominate other groups. And he, so far, has not been able to rein them in. And this is hugely problematic. And of course, in a way, he is, on the one hand, trying to please the West, but at the same time, these are his constituents who see him as a hero, who call him the conqueror, al-Fatih. And he also doesn't, in a way, want to lose their loyalty. And so the question is open regarding whether he'll be able to bring them on board and, in a way, push them towards the direction of moderation, or if he'll be able to at least quell them, or if he will actually, in a way, embrace some of their more problematic elements and infuse the new Syria with this very problematic ideology.
Well, to that, I think, in addition to trying to balance basically what the West, as well as many Syrians, want from him with basically those extremist elements that fought against him. And I think as the recent escalation has shown, that he still needs them in order to basically ensure the security in the region, or in Syria in particular. Now, what would basically that mean for him? Because he has been making quite good promises since before even he reached Damascus. But most of those promises have not been implemented in a manner that really meets people's expectations.
He's only had 3 months.
He definitely, and that is something we have to keep in mind for sure. But I think when we talk about that, we are not only talking about basically what has happened so far, but what he's most likely to do in the upcoming months, because that will be quite crucial. And I think this is the point I want to end with, because I think moving forward, many people are still basically giving him that benefit of the doubt and waiting to see what he will do. So far, he has a lot of credit. That credit is running out, but he has not lost it. And what comes next will determine whether he will maintain it and increase it, or he will lose it all.
Reem, do you think he can keep the benefit of the doubt?
Not for very long. I think he is willing to have a stable Syria, but he's unable. But no one else in Syria is able to bring stability on his or her own. That is the dilemma. What we needed really is like a transitional body where different figures come together. Syria is very, very fragmented, and there's so many overlapping conflicts that are still there. The regime is gone, but the conflict is still there. And it's not just Sunni Alawite at all. I mean, we have Sunni-Sunni conflicts. We have divisions across all lines. And it takes joint efforts to bridge these different groups together. But also on our own, we cannot do it. No other country emerging from such a bitter conflict did it on its own. But what we need is not a unilateral intervention from one particular country that will only make things worse. We need more a neutral, multilateral presence, like UN technical assistance for the things that Lina mentioned, security sector reform, DDR, financial sector reform, transitional justice, like have a hybrid model where the national courts can work with international ones to bring some people to justice. We just cannot do it on our own. Everyone can say the right thing to please the Europeans and the Americans, but the ability to implement and get things done and join these pieces together is really beyond one personality.
This is fascinating, and this is something you've worked particularly on. What are the conditions for building or rebuilding a state, if you like? Do you think he and the people around him have got an appetite to draw on help in that way?
They want to head that way, but I don't think they want to admit that they are unable to do it. They still feel very proud and they can do it on their own. And sadly, it looks like it's going to take failure for them to realize that they cannot. And what happened to the coast during the last week was a failure that they should have known before. The agreement with Assad, with Syrian Democratic Forces, should have took place before these massacres. If it happened before, we would have probably seen less a lower level of atrocities. He had to reach out to vicious groups, al-Hamzat and al-Amshat, because he wasn't able on his own previous forces were unable on their own to respond to what happened at the coast. He didn't have enough financial resources, which is why he focuses on sanctions a lot. The other groups did have actually more resources. And these groups who committed these crimes actually are part of the army that he said he now rules and he now controls.
Both you and Hyde have described how it's a race for him against, if you like, the economic conditions which are eroding the support even of those who warmly support him. We're going to come on in a moment to talk about what other countries should do, particularly countries in the region. But I'm wondering whether you think that Western countries in particular should lift economic sanctions against Syria to give him that bit of help at this point.
I think the economic sanctions should be lifted to help the people, not to help particular regime. But for that to happen, they shouldn't just be lifted blindly. Together with that, in parallel, there need to be a process that ensures that the lifting of the sanctions is going to revive the economy in a way that benefits the people and not to benefit a selected few elites. There are some worrying signs that we are getting a new corrupt regime, being established. The fact that he appointed his brother as the head of the investment board, which is going to control all the money, that's not a good sign. So we need, with that, all the benchmarks to be in place to ensure also we're going to have transparency and accountability. We need to know where the money is going to go because we wanted to help the people. That what would bring a stable country.
How important are elections? Is there any real talk of them?
He mentioned elections, but he mentioned that this will take time because you'll need to start with having a constitution and then having a transitional body and having a legislative body. And then by the time you have those, you will be able to then start organizing parties and then allow for the actual law that will manage the elections to be established. And then when the time is right, he said that elections will be held. And I think it does make sense not to hold elections right now because A, there is no political engagements in Syria or even movements. B, if he basically runs for election now, he will definitely win. There is no doubt about that. Because of those issues, I think it's not about, again, what will happen and whether elections will take place right now or not. There are many issues that could basically ensure people's as well as communities' engagements in the processes that will lead to the elections, because the elections are one of the sort of measures that will allow people participation, but it's not the only measure. And so far, we have not seen that. Most of those processes that Reem basically mentioned before have not really ensured that there is real engagement from different communities in the basically decision-making related to them.
And we're going really quite briefly, as we must, over them, but the things you've touched on go very deep about how do you get the courts justice that people trust, how do you get the police working, something that many, many countries find almost impossible, even when very developed. How do you get police that people trust, and so on? And obviously, if it doesn't progress in the way that you've both been sketching out that it might hopefully progress, then you get people easily concluding that the country can be united only by a strong man, and you're back to that. Let's broaden this out then to our final bit, which is about what the neighbours are doing. There are lots of neighbours. They are all intensely concerned with the outcome of this. They have different visions of that outcome in mind. Lina, can you take us around what the main players in this are doing? And I'm thinking particularly of Turkey and Israel, but there are others.
Yeah, there are others. When it comes to Turkey, recently there was an agreement signed between the head of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a mainly Kurdish military force that has been ruling the northeast under a self-administration, and the central government under al-Shara. And this is a positive development that I'm sure Turkey will welcome, because the last thing that Turkey wanted was to see a Kurdish state on its border in northeast Syria. So the fact that now this agreement says that the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, have agreed to integrate into the Syrian state will be welcome news for Turkey. But we have to be careful not to see...
Will it be news for Turkey, or did Turkey actually play a part in it?
Oh, I mean, definitely Turkey has played a part, but not in terms of brokering the agreement as such, but in terms of putting pressure on the Kurds. But here we have to just bear in mind that the Kurds in the northeast are under a lot of pressure because of the US, because US forces are set to withdraw at some point. And if they are to withdraw, then the Kurds would lose a lot of the status that they have acquired politically over the years. So in a way, I feel that they had to agree to some sort of compromise, and this would be good news for Turkey. But al-Shara is not a Turkish puppet, so there are also complexities in that particular relationship. He doesn't just, do whatever Turkey wants. So Turkey will also be seeking to continue to assert its influence in Syria. And this is something that Israel is trying to do, but in a very different way. Israel is not seeing all these developments in Syria positively. It continues to attack in the south, and there it is capitalizing on some of the grievances of another minority, which is the Druze community, trying to present its attacks as first about securing Israel from a state that is ruled by Islamists. That's how Israel is characterizing Syria, and at the same time saying we are there to protect the Druze community that is also feeling a bit vulnerable. So everybody in a way is like what happened throughout the duration of the Syrian conflict, using Syria to further their own interests. But the biggest spoiler, in my view, is Iran. Iran did play a role in the mobilization of the former Assad regime officers on the west coast. Hezbollah from Lebanon was also part of this. Iran does not want to see a stable Syria. Now,
Iran obviously had very close links with the Assad regime, and quite a few of us were in Doha at the point when Assad fell and saw the Iranian ministers running for their transport back home. So startled did they seem by what had happened. So they lost from that, but they're still, as you said,
absolutely.
trying to influence what is happening.
Yeah, they are, because Syria was a key component of their self-declared axis of resistance. This is how Tehran characterized its proxies in the region, and it has mainly lost its influence in Lebanon. So it's trying both in Lebanon and in Syria to have some sort of resurrection. And again,
so what does it want? Does it want to destabilize this new regime in Damascus?
Yes, it wants to show that this regime is a failure, and it wants to restore some of its own influence. And being a spoiler is the only tool it has at the moment, and it is deploying that. Which, of course,
and what form is this spoiling taking?
I mean, as I said, cooperation with former Assad regime officers, continuing to smuggle drugs. There was recently a shipment of drugs that was sent to Jordan that was thankfully discovered. Smuggling weapons continues. It still tries to send funds to those entities. And therefore, when it comes to the Syrian government, it has this additional external factor to deal with when it comes to securing Syria.
Reem, how would you weigh up the forces trying to help President Shara and those trying to undermine the new administration?
It's difficult to weigh them against each other. Again, I think what al-Shara really desperately needs is for the economy to be revived, and that needs the lifting of the sanctions. So all the support he's getting from many Gulf countries like Qatar and Saudi doesn't mean much if the sanctions are not lifted, because everyone is worried about what the Americans are going to do. But I agree with Lina. I mean, the Iranians are trying to spoil. It was very much predicted. That's the only role they can play. They have always played the role of spoiler in Syria, but it's not very difficult to counter that. I think all those young Syrians across the country who could be recruited in any counter project should be absorbed in different kind of projects that rebuild the country, development, reconstructions, and so forth. And that really needs for the economy to kickstart. And for that, we really need meaningful support to the country, not to the regime itself. We need support for the people from all these external powers that uses the leverage they have to change the type of governance we're getting. The people on the top, as in like getting more represented figures in the government, and to ensure that the system of governance itself is not going to exclude people. It's going to allow the areas themselves to play a role in rebuilding their localities, like have more decentralization, more inclusions of people from all backgrounds.
Lina, do you think the US is interested in the outcome in Syria? In December, Trump posted on Truth Social, his social network, that Syria is not our fight.
He definitely wants US troops out, not just from Syria, but basically everywhere else that is in a similar kind of context. I think the key interest is Iran, which is why even if the troops leave, the US will be staying to engage on Iran in the region. And this is because of Israeli security more than anything else. After the horrific Hamas attacks of October 7, Israel can't afford for Iran to run around and be influential as a destabilizing force in the Middle East. So Syria has played a huge role in that, and therefore the US cannot afford to just turn away.
That is a hugely important point, and we're hearing from Trump officials saying, look, first we do Ukraine, then we do Gaza, then Iran, whatever that means. So thanks for making that point. Hayed, where is Russia in this? We're hearing Russia in obviously other news stories at the moment to do with Ukraine, but its connection with the Assad regime, the foothold it had built up there, was one of the most adroit things in the view of many Western politicians that President Putin had managed to do, and then it lost when he fell. Where is it now?
Well, unlike Iran, where the basically Shara administration has made it clear that they don't want to have anything to do with Iran, al-Shara seems to be more willing to cooperate and reach an agreement with Russia that will allow it to not only maintain its forces and bases in Syria, but potentially to even have some sort of economic and as well as military cooperation with it. And I think this is a concern for some of the European allies who are currently supporting the Shara administration. But before that, going back to the earlier two questions you mentioned, I think if you want to talk about enemies versus allies, I think right now it's safe to say that Shara has more allies than enemies. But will that last long? This is the question, because although you have many allies, some of those allies have competing interests. And I think trying to also balance those allies is not always a good or an easy task to do. When it comes to basically Iran, it's clearly not gonna be happy with what's happening, but they are also trying to open the diplomatic channels and try to see if that's an option. For the U.S., I think it's important to keep in mind that Syria is not always only about Syria, because we talk about the allies that the regime, the Shara has right now. You have Turkey and you have Saudi, and those two allies are quite important to the U.S., so they could potentially increase the level of U.S. interest in Syria because of that.
That is a great point, that Syria is not only about Syria, and also I love your image of the nightly calculation, which I'm sure many leaders are doing at the moment, of how many allies have I got and how many enemies. Let me bring you, Reem and Haid, just back to Syria at the moment and life there. And is it your sense that Syrians, many of whom are delighted to see Assad fall, are now going back, or are they leaving?
Some are going back. The initial wave that we've seen, I think, already took place, is not going to continue with the same intensity. Like some refugees who were in the regional countries went back, but that kind of have slowed down now. There are some expats are going back, but they're finding it very difficult to settle in there. But most alarmingly, I'm hearing increasingly very high number of people saying, we want to leave. This is not a country to live in, especially after that episode of violence. Many people from Alawite background and Christian backgrounds are saying very clearly, we want to leave. Whatever it takes, we don't want to stay.
I think it's safe to say that according to different estimates, over 300,000 refugees went back after the fall of the regime from the region. And you have thousands of internally displaced people who went back to their areas. But we have to remember that the situation there, as we mentioned earlier, is not great. And even those who are going back, they're going back to a situation where they're struggling to meet. So that situation is not really encouraging others to basically make a similar decision and go there. But that does not mean that this will not, it could go either way. If Al-Shara is able to really improve the economic situation as well as the security situation, then we could see more and more people willing to go back there, especially if the economic situation allows for people to find livelihood opportunities there and make ends meet. If not, then we will most likely see more people trying to leave Syria, including those who returned to Syria recently.
We're going to have to stop with that notion of it being very much in the balance, but at least some decisions hanging on the US and Europe, particularly about sanctions. That's all we've got time for this week. I'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Haid, Dr. Reem Turkmani and Dr. Lina Khatib. If you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review and join us next week. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. Goodbye for now.